So you might remember last time that I talked a little bit about the conservative movement and the addition of the Imahot, the matriarchs, to the Amidah. And particularly, I wanted to mention that the root we had seen, Vadonai Pakad et Sarah, that God remembered Sarah, and that idea of God remembering is the epithet that gets attached to Sarah in the Amidah. So the thing is that I was then asked a question, and the question was, how come Rachel before Leah? You might remember that. God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, God of Sarah, God of Rebekah, God of Rachel and Leah, since Leah is the older of the two sisters, and shouldn't she be mentioned first? So I was pondering that, and it seemed to me that it wasn't the only place. And where did they get this from? And then I remembered that when there are these blessings, and this is an old tradition, much older than the conservative Amidah, that when parents bless their children on Friday night, the blessing for boys is may God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. And for girls, it is may God make you like, there it is, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. So already we see earlier on that this doesn't answer the question of why. It perhaps begins to answer the question of why in the conservative Amidah we have it first. But we can go back further than that, which is to the book of Ruth. And in the book of Ruth, Ruth now has a child at the end of the book. Naomi has a grandchild, and it is said of this child by the women in the town, may this child grow up to be, may it be a blessing to you, like Sarah, like Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah. So we already see it there very early. And then one more place, and I think this perhaps begins to explain the why. Why is Rachel more important than Leah in the tradition? And I don't think it's just because she was the favored daughter, that the favored wife, right? That Jacob had wanted to be married to Rachel and was tricked and wound up having to marry Leah first. And so she was Jacob's heart's desire. I don't think that's quite enough. And in Jeremiah, there's this wonderful scene of the people of Israel going into exile after the temple has been destroyed and walking by way of Bethlehem, which is where Rachel was buried. And Jeremiah envisions the Rachel at her tomb weeping for the children of Israel in exile. That there's this deep connection between Rachel and Rachel's as an aspect of kind of love and mercy for the entire Jewish people as they're going in exile. There are also some connections between Rachel and mercy in general in Jewish mystical literature in the Kabbalah. Leah is associated with justice, but Rachel with mercy. So I think you can look at all of that and that long history and perhaps understand why this choice was made. I don't know if there are any questions about that. Go ahead, Sandy.
And yet Rachel's the one that had the idols, right?
Yes, and that's really hard to explain. It does not seem, given everything, that her taking these figures with her when they leave Laban's house is necessarily idolatry. And I'll have much more to say about that when we come to that story sometime in 2029. I don't know. The rate we're going, who knows? Anyway, let's get back. We're going to get back to our text now. And we're picking up actually with Genesis 21. And we're really going to begin with,
Page, please.
I'm sorry,
What page, please?
in the Eitz Chaim, it's page 114.
114. Thank you.
Sure. So Genesis 21, we stopped right after the introduction, the first 8 verses. So we're not going to talk about them, but I'm just going to go back and read them so we have some context. One second. So beginning in verse 1, God took note of Sarah as God had promised and did for Sarah as God had spoken. She conceived, bore a son to Abraham in his old age at the time that God had said, and Abraham gave his newborn son the name of Isaac. And when Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham had circumcised him as God had commanded. He was 100 years old when Isaac was born. And Sarah said, God has brought me laughter. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. Who would have said that Abraham that Sarah would suckle a child? Yet I have borne a son in his old age. The child, that is Ishmael, grew up and was weaned, and Abraham held a great feast on that day that Isaac was weaned. Okay, and now we're going to pick up with verse 9. And Sarah, and it's not clear to me whether this is at this weaning feast, I suspect not, considerably later, but Sarah sees the son of Hagar, who we know to be Ishmael, but he's not being named here. Hamitzrit, the Egyptian, who had born to Abraham. And that son is mitzachek, is playing. Now, the word mitzachek is an interesting word. Of course, Isaac is named for it. Mitzachek means laughter. She has a very strong reaction to seeing Ishmael playing. We're going to see in a second. And so the question is, why is this troubling to her? Ishmael is, by the way, not young. He's already 14, something like that, 15. So he's not a young kid. He's playing, and perhaps playing with Isaac. So why is that? What does that mean? So we saw another use of this same verb when we looked at the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? And you remember that the angels came to Sodom, came to Lot's house, and eventually tells Lot that he has to take his family and get out of town as quickly as possible because God is going to rain destruction down on the cities. And Lot tells his family, we have to get out of there. And his son-in-laws treat him like someone who is mitzachek. They are mitzachek. They are laughing. The word, though, I think in the story of Lot in Sodom has this sense of mocking. Like they're laughing at him, right? They're mocking him. And perhaps there is an element here of mockery. The other way to read this, and the medieval rabbis want to read something almost sexual into it. And that really relates, if we wanted to see it that way, there is that story, which will come too soon, about Isaac, who is passing off Rebekah, his wife, as his sister. They're in Gerar. And the king of Gerar, Avimelech, sees them being mitzachek, and Avimelech realizes that, brothers and sisters do not act that way with each other, right? Translated, sporting, there's something affectionate and loving between them, which is far more than the affection that a brother and sister should have for each other. And therefore, the jig is up. Avimelech realizes that they're not brother and sister. But that also means that this verb can have a kind of sexual overtone. I don't read that here, but there are medieval rabbis who do. I think for me, the key to understanding this is, and Robert Alter mentions this in his commentary, I think it is tied to the name Yitzhak. And as Alter says, she sees him Isaac-ing, that she sees him in some place, some way, taking the place of Isaac. He is, after all, the oldest son. And so she says to Abraham, and now we're at verse 11, Garesh ha'amah hazot be'et bina, send out this slave woman and her son. Why? Ki lo yirash ben ha'amah hazot im b'ni im Yitzhak. He will not, or should not, the son of this slave woman should not inherit along with my son, Isaac. So this is about inheritance. She sees something in his behavior which suggests that Isaac will be at a disadvantage. And remember, and I think this is important, though she is a servant, when Ishmael was born, Abraham had claimed him as a son. And once he was claimed as a son, he is entitled to an inheritance. So from Sarah's position, this is really threatening. And she asks that he be sent away. Now, there's an interesting law represented in some ancient Near Eastern texts that the adopted son of a slave is entitled to inheritance unless the slave and her son are freed, at which point he is no longer entitled to inheritance. He gets his freedom, loses his inheritance. Now, here I don't think there's a sense that Ishmael is a slave, quite the opposite. But there is perhaps an echo in this story of that idea. So she says, send them away. And here we see something in verse 11. Vayera hadavar hazeh ma'od be'enei Avraham. Abraham was really upset. This was bad in his eyes. Why? Al adot beno, on account of his son. And here again, this is Abraham's son. Abraham is not happy about it. He doesn't want to send his son away. But God intervenes. And God says to Abraham, don't be distressed. Don't be upset over the boy. Or your servant, whatever Sarah tells you, do as she says, for it is through Isaac that offspring will be continued for you. Listen to Sarah. Words that, and do whatever she says. Words that husbands ever since have dreaded. Listen to your wife, do whatever she says. Not really, but okay. And a promise. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation for him. So he won't inherit from you, but he will, because he is your seed, he will become the father of a great nation, right? So don't worry, God says. So early the next morning, now I'm going to pay very careful attention to language. And I want to do that because we're going to see that this story and the story that comes not immediately, but almost immediately afterwards, which is the story of the binding of Isaac, has a great deal in common with each other. So I'm going to emphasize some of those common elements as we move forward. And the first one is Vayashkem Avraham Baboker. And Abraham got up early in the morning. Well, getting up early shows a certain alacrity. He's doing, God said, listen to her. He's getting up early. He's going to do it. But we'll see the same language exactly in that story. And what does Abraham do? Vayikach lechem v'chamat mayim. He takes bread and water, and he gives them to Hagar, placing them on her shoulder. And together with the child, I don't think this means placing them her shoulder with the child on her shoulder. This is an adolescent, but places the bread and the water on her shoulder and sends them away. So this is, I want to take note of this also, the placing on the shoulder, which seems to be an irrelevant detail. Right? He gave her bread and water and sent her on her way. And what happens? And now we get this story. Vayishlaheha v'telech v'teva b'midbar Beersheba. So he sends her away, and she wanders around in the wilderness of Beersheba. So why is she wandering? One suggestion is that she's gotten lost. Where is she headed? She's probably heading to Egypt. We've emphasized again and again that she's an Egyptian. If you're an Egyptian woman who has been sent off with your child out of the household, where do you go? Probably you go home. But the problem here is she gets lost. She's wandering around. And I want to emphasize this because I want to be fair to Abraham. Did he give her enough provisions for the journey? He gives her bread and water. We're going to see it's not adequate. And so to defend Abraham, perhaps she's lost. Perhaps she's using up the food that she's been given and the water. And when the water is gone, it says she leaves the child under the bushes. The Hebrew is actually stronger than that, but tashlech hayeled. It's almost like she threw him under, not a very, very kind image. But, this is not a baby. Although he's being called here a yeled, which is a child. He's soon going to be called a nar, which is someone older. And one gets a sense that she sees him. This is her child. So
How old is he around now?
He's probably 14, 15.
That much? I didn't realize he was an adolescent.
Yeah. Oh,
I
no.
thought he was a lot younger.
This is not a baby. This is not a baby. But she puts him, she takes him and she puts him under one of the bushes. Presumably this will at least shade him from the sun. And she goes and she sits at a distance, right? And the distance is a bow shot away. Why is that important? Well, we're going to see that Ishmael is fated to be an archer, right? That will be who he is, a mighty archer. And so perhaps the language here is already foreshadowing that. I have to say it's troubling to read this. This mother who does not want to be with her child when he dies, is protecting her feelings, but leaving him, she can't bear it, as it were, but it seems to me that she's failing a little bit in terms of her motherly duty to be with him. At any rate, she says she doesn't want to see it, and she's sitting afar, and she is crying. That's the scene. So, V'yishma Elohim, and God heard. Remember what his name is. His name is Yishmael, and God hears. So, in fact, this is a play on words, perhaps. He has been nameless up to this point, and now we get a an echo of his name. And God heard the voice of, now it's not the Yeled, but the Na'ar, the lad, reflecting the fact that he actually is not a baby, not a child, and an angel of God, right? And we've seen angels before, a number of them doing God's bidding, being God's mouthpiece. And one of them calls to Hagar, min hashamayim, from heaven. So this angel is calling Hagar and saying, what? Vayomer la, he says, ma lach Hagar, what's doing with you? what, which is really quite a statement, right? Well, he knows what's doing with her, but here's the thing he says. Al tiri, don't be afraid. This is exactly the same language that God used with Abraham. There it was al tira, don't be afraid, ani magen alecha, I will be your shield. You might remember that from a couple of weeks ago, right? So what I'm wanting to draw your attention to are parallels between Abraham and Hagar. Now, let me stop also and say, where is Abraham in this narrative? Other than sending her away, he's not here. In fact, the focus of this story seems to be on Hagar and also Ishmael, but primarily Hagar. And I would go further and say this is an extremely sympathetic portion. That the Torah is with her and God is with her in her anguish. The angel says, don't be afraid. Ki shama Elohim, that's Yishmael again. Shama Elohim, God has heard. Et kol hanar, the voice of the child, ka'asher husham, where he is. So this is the crying child. We haven't seen this before. She's been crying, but now we know he's been crying. And this is God hearing the afflicted. And that's a theme throughout the Bible. We see it in the Exodus story. The people cry out, and God hears, and God acts. We saw it with Sodom. The cry of Sodom has come before God. God acts. And here, God hears this child. God who said, send them, listen to Sarah, here's the child where he is. And I think it's not just physically that he's under a bush, but in his dire circumstances. And then God says to Hagar, Kumi se'i et hanar, come, lift up the child, hold him by his hand, and I will make a great nation, for I'm going to make a great nation. So she has distanced herself, and now this angel is saying, go and take him by the hand. Don't worry, he's not going to die. This is once a return to a more maternal image. And then we get this line, right? So it says, Vayipach Elohim et enecha. God opened her eyes and she saw a well of water. So here she was in her distress, wandering around. The water was gone. She thought that they were going to die, put Ishmael under the bush. And all that time, there was actually a well there. But in her anguish, she didn't see it. There is no suggestion in this text that somehow God created a well. This is the well that was there, that now that she has been reassured by the angel and told they're not going to die, and she looks and she sees this well, which will be her salvation. And she goes and she fills the skin, the empty water skin, with water, and she gives it to the boy. Him before her gives it to him. So this sort of maternal feeling has now returned. And then we get God was with the boy. He grew up. He dwells in the wilderness, and he becomes Roveh Keshet. He becomes a bowman, and this is a sort of an expert. That's the sense of the language. An expert. What's the archer? I don't know why it says bowman here, but he's an archer. And he lives in Haran, and his mother finds him a wife from Egypt. So happy ending there, right? So we're going to leave the story of Ishmael. He will return, and now we're going to move to something else that is happening at the same time. At exactly that time, Avimelech and Pichol, chief of his troops, said to Abram. Remember, Avimelech said after the business with Sarah as a wife, as a sister, he says, you can live wherever you want. My land is open to you, and presumably he does. And Avimelech says to Abraham, God is with you in everything you do, and therefore I see you're blessed. Therefore, swear to me by God that you will not deal falsely with me or my kith and kin, I guess is the way it's translated here, but you will deal with me and with the land in which you have sojourned as loyally as I've dealt. I've been good to you. You'll be good to me. You be good to me, right? So Abraham says that he swears this. So this is a kind of treaty that they're making. And then we get V'hochiach Avraham et Avimelech al odot be'er hamayim. And then Avimelech reproaches Abraham for the well of the water, which the servants of Avimelech had seized. I'm sorry, exactly the opposite. Abraham reproaches Avimelech for the well of water that the servants of Avimelech had seized. So Abraham, now they're on good terms, they're buddies, and Abraham says, your servants took my well, right? And you can see the semantic tie in here between this story and the one before. We were also talking about a well. Avimelech says, what? I don't know that. I don't know about this. You didn't tell me. I've not heard of it until today, right? So Avimelech says, wait a minute, we've made this pact. Now you're saying my servants have done something wrong, and you never told me. Well, I didn't know. So, and maybe, there's a sense here that Abraham, after all, was a resident alien. He was allowed to live in this land. But, resident aliens are kind of, they don't have much power. Right? They're strangers in the land. And so servants can take his well, and what redress does he have? But now that Avimelech has come to him and made this pact, now he can talk about it. He says, so I mean, perhaps Abraham didn't mention it before because he didn't think that it would matter, that his complaint would be registered. Avimelech says, we didn't know it. And then Abraham gives sheep and oxen to Avimelech, and they make a pact. So this is the kind of formal treaty. Abraham has sworn it, but now and it says, V'yikretu shnehem brit. They make a covenant, really. And Abraham then takes 7 ewes of the flock by themselves. So Abraham, in addition to what Abraham already gave him, takes 7 ewes, and Avimelech says to Abraham, what's the 7 ewes about? And Abraham replies to him, and now we're in verse 30. Take these 7 ewes from me as proof that I dug this well. So Abraham is saying he's maintaining his claim on the well, but he's also kind of paying for it. Because I want clear title to this well. And Avimelech accepts it. And the place is called Beersheba, for there the 2 of them swore an oath. Now, Sheva is an oath, right? Swearing, but it's also 7. So here, I think one element is that this is, and Beer means a well. This is the well of 7, or the well that Abraham was able to claim absolute title to with 7 ewes. So there's a kind of play on words there. And when they have concluded the covenant, Avimelech and Pichol, the chief of his troops, depart, go back to the lands of the Philistines. Abraham plants a tamarisk at Beersheba, invoking the name of the Lord. This is the first time we use the word El Olam. We usually think the word Olam means world, right? The Adon Olam, right? Lord of the world. But Olam really doesn't mean, it's not related just to space. It's also related to time. So El Olam means everlasting God, or I think we would translate it eternal God, who was, who is, who will be, right? And this use, which we see it in the Amidah, we see it in other places in liturgy, much, much, much later, but it's certainly taken from here. And Abraham resides there for a long time. So this treaty now means that God's promises to Abraham have begun to be fulfilled. God promises Abraham progeny, and that his descendants, not only will he have descendants, they will come through Isaac. Abraham's progeny has been given. He has 2 sons. One of them, Ishmael, will be the father of great nation, and Isaac is the child who will now inherit and whose children will become eventually the people of Israel. The other promise, the land. And we have a treaty now. It's in the land of the Philistines, but the treaty means that Abraham's situation is settled, and presumably the land of Canaan is also settled. And it is with that sense that God's promises have begun to be fulfilled that we're going to see the next story. Before we do that, I am going to open it up for questions. Any questions on Hagar in the wilderness? Anything at all? Harry,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah, just an observation that Sarah is the one who presented Hagar to Abraham. So Sarah, in that sense, is responsible for Ishmael being
Yes.
born to Hagar. But
Yes,
of course, at that time, she didn't expect to get pregnant herself. And
exactly.
I see Sarah's reaction as just simply wanting her own progeny, her own to do the inheritance.
Yeah. Oh, I think
And you see that in history with the kings who have multiple wives. There's this political intrigue where the queen kind of jockeys for political power and to get her own son as the successor.
yeah, well, you certainly see it in the story of King David. King David at the end of his life, his children are vying for succession, and Bathsheba, his wife, one of his wives, comes in and says, "Did you promise that Solomon, my son, would be?" But there's no evidence that he actually made that promise. So this political intrigue, yes, I think that's exactly right. Sarah is concerned that her child be the inheritor. And even though he was responsible, as you say, for Ishmael, for Hagar, now that she has her own child, you know. I also want to point out one other thing, and that is that from the point of view of Torah, let's put it from God's point of view, right? The covenant is a spiritual as well as physical. And the idea that you need a person who's worthy of carrying, forget about primogeniture. Okay? Who is the one who really, we see this in the next generation, somebody is not muted. Everybody is muted. It's just a problem. At any rate, we see this in the next generation with Esau and Jacob, who is the worthy successor between the twins. And there may be an element of that here too. Sandy, did you want to chime in?
Yes,
And Myra.
please. So I find it surprising that Abraham, after Sodom and Gomorrah, pleading for people he doesn't even know, he's not even having any sort of interchange discussion with God about sending Ishmael away, even though God says that there will be a nation coming out of Ishmael. He's not going to die. Forgetting that, there's going to be, how can he live with bread and water alone? I mean, what is Abraham thinking? He could have said something like, it's going to be hard for them, and I don't want to put them under any hardships or something along those lines.
Yes, I think Abraham could have said that, but I think he has a reassurance from God, and that's probably enough for him. Now, your question about Sodom and Gomorrah becomes much more acute in the next story.
Yeah.
God tells Abraham to sacrifice. Right. So I'll come back to that when we get there.
All right, thank you.
Sure. Myra, you have to unmute. Great. Go ahead.
Not me.
Yeah.
I apologize if somebody asked this question. Had a very important phone call and I was interrupted. But when you say Ishmael is going to be part of a great nation, yes, is that the beginning of the Muslims?
Okay, so it's not the beginning of the Muslims, though they do trace if you look in the Quran, Ishmael becomes the figure that they look back to as their, father in some ways. But remember that Islam is actually the latest religion among the three monotheistic faiths. It doesn't come till the 600s after the Common Era. So it would be hard to claim that this is actually, they become the Muslims, but certainly Islam does trace its spiritual ancestry back to Islam. the Quran takes motifs from the Bible, and in this case, they emphasize the fact that it was really Ishmael who was the chosen son. Okay, I want to go on just because we will run out of time, and this story, we don't even have enough time to do it properly, but we're going to try. Okay, so chapter 22. After these things, which is sequential, right? And as I mentioned before, things are
They're all frozen except me.
in order.
Okay.
In this case, they clearly are in order. As Saul and Sylvia, if you could mute, it would be helpful.
Yes, I can't find my, it's
Okay,
not working. I'm having a lot of,
don't worry about it then. All right, just keep things as quiet as you can. Okay, so after these things, after it seems like everything is set, so God appears to Abraham, and God, it says, Nisa et Abraham. God tested Abraham. So this reminds me of the commercials that they used to have, where they would say, "Professional driver, don't try this at home." Right? Abraham, hey, and don't worry about what's going to come. It's only a test, right? It's striking because nowhere else do we see the narrator telling us it's a test. And of course, that raises immediately the question of what's the test? And I want to argue that it's not what you might think it is. So, what does God say to Abraham? He says, first of all, he says to him, he gets his attention and he says, Abraham, Abraham. And Abraham says, Hineni. Hineni means, here I am. But it means much more than that. It is at your service. I'm ready. Whatever you ask, I will do. And then God says, take your son, your only son, I don't think favored is right here, the one you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah, and sacrifice him there on one of the mountains that I will show you. So, first of all, the language here should remind you of something, and that is God's first call to Abraham. Leave your land, your native land, your father's house, and go to the place where I will show you. The rabbis say that Abraham faced 10 tests, right? 10 times when he was in a situation which would lead him to question God. And this is actually the 9th of the 10 tests. Now, the fact that he doesn't argue is troubling here, right? So I think the rabbis are troubled enough that they turn this into a dialogue between Abraham and God, and they tell us the other part of the dialogue, which is Abraham. So God says, take your son, Abraham. I have 2 sons. God says, your only one, your favorite one, this one is the only one for his mother. This one is the only one for his mother. God says, the one you love. Abraham says, I love both my children. God says, yeah, Isaac, take Isaac, right? So you get there a little bit, at least in the rabbinic interpretation, there's a little bit of a sense of Abraham sort of pushing back. Now, there's a deep problem in this text, and that is Isaac is the promised child. Isaac is the one that God said again and again, your descendants will come from Isaac. And now Isaac is supposed to die. So how does God's promise get fulfilled if Isaac is supposed to die? And that question, I think, is part of the test. Will Abraham believe in God enough to believe that God's promise through Isaac is going to be sustained? Will he, in fact, trust in God, despite the fact of what's being told to him, that it'll work out? Now, another reason I think why, two other reasons why I think God doesn't protest here. One is that at Sodom and Gomorrah, God is explaining God's self to Abraham. Let me share with Abraham what I'm going to do, right? There is that sense, God, in a sense, expresses a kind of openness to dialogue with Abraham at Sodom and Gomorrah. Here we don't see that. We just see a command, a clear command. And in the face of God's clear demand, I don't think Abraham has a lot of leeway. The other thing is that God is not asking anything extraordinary of Abraham. This was done in antiquity. People did sacrifice their children. God is asking Abraham to do what other gods did in the ancient Near East, the kinds of requests that they made. The problem here is that everything's supposed to be dependent on Isaac. At any rate, Abraham does not argue. But what does he do? He, early the next morning, beep, 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 Hagar, early the next morning, what does he do? He saddles his ass. He takes with him two of his servants. Now, these servants, it's really unclear what job they have, because they're not saddling the ass. They're not going to carry the wood. Exactly what is their role in this story? And that remains to be seen. And he takes Isaac. He splits the wood for the burnt offering and sets out for the place that God had told him. On the third day, he looks up and sees the place from afar. He recognizes the place he is going to, but for 3 days, Abraham and Isaac have been walking together with Abraham's understanding that this will be the last time he sees his son. And the pathos in this story, though we're getting very, very scant details, is really profound, I think. And then Abraham says to the servants, stay here with the donkey. Maybe that's their job. The boy and I will go up there. We will worship and we'll come back. This does not sound like Abraham is planning to sacrifice his son, or he's giving them a message, not so that they should not worry or that they should not interfere. It's really unclear, but he does say they'll come back together. Now, Abraham takes the wood for the burnt offering and places it on his son. Ding, ding, ding. Hagar took the bread and water. Abraham took the bread and water and placed it on his son, Ishmael. Right, so you see these parallels. He got up early, he placed it on his child, and Abraham takes the firestone and the knife. It says etaesh, the fire, but presumably he hasn't been carrying fire for 3 days in the wilderness. So this is the stone that he will use to spark the fire to make the burnt offering. So Abraham is holding the knife. That's what's dangerous. And it says the two of them walk together. And now Isaac says to Abraham, Aviv, my father. And Avi, my father. And Abraham says, Hineni, here I am. The same word that he used to God. At your service. I'm ready to do your bidding, right? And you see in this moment how torn Abraham is. Hineni to God, Hineni to Isaac. And now Isaac asks a question. I see the fire stone and the wood. Where's the sheep? we didn't bring a sheep with us. How are we going to do it? And Abraham answers in this very enigmatic way. He says to him, Elohim yireh lo haseh. God will see to the sheep. This word see, it's yireh, it's the mountain of seeing. It's always this root of seeing. But he says, God will see to the sheep for the sacrifice, my son. And that my son at the end creates great ambiguity. God, don't worry, God will take care of the sheep, or God will see to the sheep. Who is my son? Right? Isaac, then it says, right after this, they go on together. Well, we knew that they were already walking together. That language was already used. But here it has a different impact. Isaac has asked about the sacrifice. Where's the sheep? Abraham has given him this answer, and Isaac walks together with Abraham. It has not ruptured the relationship between them. The rabbis say Isaac is a willing sacrifice. That in fact, the greatness of Isaac in some ways, this is not called the test of Isaac, the test of Abraham. When the rabbinic literature refers to it, they don't call it Nisayon Avraham, they call it Akedat Yitzhak, the binding of Isaac. Okay, so they get to the place which God had told him. Abraham builds an altar there, and he binds Isaac, and he lays him on the altar on top of the wood. Right? Notice that 3 days we've had no detail. And now it all comes down to this moment, and Abraham is doing this, and we have no sense of protest from Isaac. And then he picks up the knife. Now, this is not, usual word for knife is sakin. This is not, this is like a cleaver, something. Ma'achelet literally means the devourer, right? So there's a horror associated with this knife. And he raises it to kill Isaac. And the angel calls out to him, not once, but twice. Avram, Avram! They get this sense of urgency, of catching him, of getting him. And again, Hineni, here I am. And the angel says, do not raise your hand or do anything for him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, and here we get it again, your only one or your favored one from me. Great, Abraham, don't do it. I see your willingness. And then we get Abraham looking up, first the angel, then Abraham looks up, and what does he see? A ram caught in the thicket by its horns. The ram was already there, right? It's like Hagar, right? That's Abraham's other son who was in jeopardy and about to die, and his mother was worried. And the angel came and said, oh, don't worry. And here the angel says, don't. And then Abraham looks and he sees the ram, and he knows what to do. There's no command to sacrifice the ram. Abraham went, took the ram, offered it as a burnt offering in place of his son. So, and Abraham names the place Adonai Yirah, the place where the Mount of Vision, or where God is seen, or something like that. Okay, so here's what I think. I don't think the test is really the test of sacrificing his son. I think the test is trusting God that it'll work out. And I think what Abraham is meant, he said, God will see to the sacrifice. And he gets there. And in fact, God has seen to the sacrifice. And what I think Abraham is meant to do is to see the ram and understand that's what God, that the ram can't, because immediately after this, he gets it. He understands. He sees the ram. He says, oh, sacrifices the ram. And God is pleased with that. God's not interested in human sacrifice. And this resolves the puzzle of how could God command Abraham to do this, even though everything depends on Isaac. Right? Abraham needed to make an imaginative leap, but Abraham has, in this moment, tunnel vision. He doesn't see it. All he sees is what God told him to do, and he's ready to do it, and he raises the knife. And then once he offers the ram, then the angel comes a second time. God swears, because you have done this, not withheld your son. But he did withhold his son. The ram becomes the son. I will bestow my blessing on you, make your descendants as numerous as the heaven, the sands of the seashore. Your descendants will seize the gates of their foes. Nations will bless themselves through your descendants, because you have obeyed my command. Abraham then returns to his servants. Isaac is not there. And they depart, and Abraham stays in Beersheba. Okay, so what are the servants doing there? I'll come to questions in a second. What are the servants doing there? My colleague, actually, she was the assistant rabbi when I was rabbi years ago, gave, I think, a wonderful explanation, which I found really touching. And that is, the servants are there to walk Abraham home. They're there to console him. He is a broken man. Right? And where's Isaac? Isaac doesn't come home with him. Isaac could come home with him. He's not dead. But this is a rupture between Abraham and Isaac. Isaac comes home without him. There's a remarkable medieval midrash, by the way, that Abraham actually killed Isaac. And he was restored by God miraculously. The midrash comes from a time when Jews were in the Middle Ages, and they were terrible pogroms where they were seeing their children killed before their eyes. And they say, what? What we had was worse than what Abraham had. And so we get this kind of midrash which suggests, no, Abraham did it. Completely counter to the whole story, just based on the idea that Isaac doesn't come back. And then he's miraculously healed by the angels. Okay, I'm going to open it up. We're going to run a little bit over. We have to take whatever questions you have before we leave this. Francesca, you are first out of the box.
So, question which I'm sure other people have. So, what happened to Isaac? I mean, we know that later on he goes to do great things, but where is he? And it's so he ends so.
So I'm going to tell you in advance where he has gone to Beer Lahai Roi, which you might remember, is the well in the wilderness where Ishmael dwells.
Oh, really?
Yes. So, and we'll see that actually stated later on that he is dwelling in Beer. So,
Do the brothers reconnect with each other?
the brothers seem to reunite after this. You imagine the story where Isaac says to Ishmael, "You think what our father did to you was bad? Let me tell you what he did to me," right? But there is this kind of reunion of these two brothers, both of which have endured these hardships. And it's really striking. We're going to come to that story pretty soon, and we're going to see some other aspect of it, which I think is really quite beautiful.
So Abraham loses both of his sons through this.
Sorry?
Abraham loses both of his sons who he loved through this,
Yes.
listening to God and listening to his wife.
Yes. And he's about to lose his wife too. Okay, other questions or comments, Barry?
About a year and a half ago, we had a mock trial at the synagogue, a mock trial of Abraham.
Yes.
Yes. So at that time, it was said that Ishmael was not excuse me, Isaac was grown, no longer a child.
Yes.
So can you remind me about how old is it?
Yeah.
Claim that Isaac is.
The tradition is he's 16 at this point.
Isaac
16.
or Abraham? Well, no, Abraham is much older.
Yeah, Abraham's 100 when Isaac is born, so he's 116.
No, 16. You said 16?
Yeah, still vigorous.
Okay, 16.
Still able to bind Isaac.
Yeah.
The ages in these stories don't work. They really don't work. If you look at the age of Rebecca when she is married, if you follow the genealogy, she's 3 years old. Even though she comes out, she's veiled. For whatever reason, whether we have different traditions, whatever it is, they don't really work. I don't think it's clear that Isaac is not a child.
Yeah.
He's carrying the wood. He's an adult or a young. So this 16 is not, it's not surprising, but you can't take these things too literally because they don't really work.
And just one other thought. So Abraham tells Isaac that God will provide the sack for the sacrifice.
Yes.
Right.
And
so it's ordinarily a sacrifice involves giving up something. You offer unblemished
yes.
Sheep or animal.
Yes.
Here, I'm just thinking, well, we're making it's kind of a weak argument. Well, you're not, if God's providing the sacrificial animal, you're not giving up anything that was your own.
I don't think the word sacrifice. It's certainly become in English, right? You give up something of your own, and in some ways it's true. But I think the idea of a burnt offering can be, and in this case is, independent of ownership. And I'm trying to think of other, I'll give this some thought if I can think of other examples of it. The word sacrifice really just means to draw near to God. That's the sense of the root, lahakriv, harov, to come close, rather than giving up.
Okay.
But as you say, typically it is. It has to be the animal that you grew or that you bought. So I'm not saying you're wrong. I just think at its root, that's not what it means, and it's clearly not what it means. Here, Sandy?
Yeah, you said me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I don't think God should have asked Abraham to do this. And I don't think that Abraham should have agreed, considering that it's murder. It's clearly murder. And I would like to read just a paragraph here that Immanuel Kant said about this.
Yeah.
Said Abraham should have replied to this putative divine voice, that I may not kill my good son is absolutely certain, but that you who appear to me as God is not certain and cannot become certain, even though the voice were to sound from the very heavens. For that a voice which one seems to hear cannot be divine, one can be certain of, in case what is commanded is contrary to moral law. However majestic or supernatural it may appear to be, one must regard it as a deception.
Yes, and Immanuel Kant is not reflecting a biblical worldview. I mean, it's as simple as that. There is no question from the biblical point of view that it is God talking.
Well, how do you know that it wasn't a dream? Because it says in the morning when he woke up.
God does speak through dreams, right? But there is no question that it is God who's addressing Abraham. I don't think the idea, you could argue, Abraham could argue that's not just. Abraham could argue, as he does for Sodom and Gomorrah, but Abraham could argue, you promised Isaac would be my heir. I don't understand how this works, right? But I don't think you can question, in terms of the biblical point of view, that it's God speaking. I don't think Abraham cannot deny, if you ask me this, you are not God. That's not a possibility. From the point of view of the Enlightenment and later thinking about God and so on, yeah, okay, but not in this context. It is belief in God in the Bible is trust in God. There's no such thing as no God, or you're not God, or there is a God. This is the God, and that's the biblical point of view. You can argue about it, and you can argue about Abraham's behavior and lack of questioning, all that, but you can't argue that this is not God from the biblical point of view.
But murder, I mean, what sort of God?
Not murder. Murder this is any more than warfare is not murder.
Yeah, but
this is something that God is demanding. And by the virtue of the fact that God has demanded it, it is not murder. Now, and again, I would remind you that this was not uncommon in antiquity. Part of the point of this story is, yes, gods do seem to demand that. Our God says, no, you can use a ram and it takes the place. You can have a substitution. That's part of the story here. That's how it works. That is, I would claim, what Abraham should have realized when he got to the mountain. And there it was, just as he said, God will provide. The problem is that Abraham has tunnel vision. And then once he sees it, he knows. He doesn't ask, God, I know you told me that I should sacrifice my son, but here is this other animal. Would it be okay? Would that count? The story is it does count. And therefore human beings should not be sacrificed. And therefore our God does not demand sacrifice. And therefore it's not a problem that God said, everything will go through Isaac, but now go and sacrifice Isaac. But we don't have to agree on this. Any last comments from anyone else? Okay, well, we've been through these two parallel stories, and I think it's really striking for me that Hagar is the Abraham figure in her story. That she is elevated, in fact, to that role, and that God is with Hagar just as God is with Abraham, that Hagar also faces the loss of her child, and God is there for her. I think it's really wrong not to read these stories, one in conjunction with the other, because I think they really do. Each one of them has something to teach us about the other. And that's part of the reason why the Torah goes out of its way to tell us these things happened after each other, that we should see them as part of the sequence. Having said that, we have finished a parsha, and we're going to go on next week with Chaye Sarah, which will complete now the destruction of Abraham's family with the death of Sarah. God asks a tremendous amount of Abraham. I wouldn't want to be. Okay, have a great week, everybody. I hope to see you next Tuesday morning.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
Rabbi.
This was a
Thank you.
wonderful class.
Thank you. Bye.